Man's Search for Meaning is pretty good, Viktor Frankl.
Man's
Search for Meaning.
Okay.
Yeah, it's good. It's not very long. It's pretty accessible. It's deep. It's fundamentally accurate, I would say. It's a profound book, and everyone can read it, I think. So.
What is it about?
The person who wrote it, Viktor Frankl, was a psychiatrist who spent time in Auschwitz.
Mm-hmm.
And so it's a discussion about totalitarianism and meaning and personal responsibility. And it's brilliant, very profound, meaningful, serious, uplifting book, even though it's very, very dark. It's a great book. It's been a best-selling book for decades because of that. If you're failing repeatedly, then there's probably something wrong. It's possible that there's something wrong with the way that you're conceptualizing the world, because you have a choice, right? If you keep making sacrifices and they don't work, there's a binary choice, and one is, well, there's something wrong with the structure of reality, and the other is there's something wrong with your approach. And so then you might say, well, let's take the first idea, there's something wrong with the structure of reality. It's like, you're really going to say that, are you? You're really going to come out and say, I know enough to judge the nature of being. And then the alternative is also quite frightening, because then, it's you that's making the mistakes, and you might be wrong at a really deep level, and that might mean that a lot of you has to burn off and be transformed. Maybe even things about yourself that you think are admirable and that you like, because your position, your self-conceptualization is so warped and wrong. Like, you can never win an argument with your wife. Like, you could if you only lived with her for one day. Right. Right? It's like, I won, see you later.
Yeah.
It's like, no, she's there the next day.
Yeah.
And then she's beat.
And she remembers that.
She does remember that. Yeah, maybe even more than you remember it. And it also might be that she was right and you just out-argued her. So, and that's something that's really worth knowing too, because sometimes, you'll have an argument with, well, let's say with your wife, and she's got something to say and it's not very well articulated. The same could be true for you. And so you can just brush it aside. But you don't want to brush it aside, because maybe there's something there, and if you don't address it, then it's not like it's going to go away, man. It's going to grow. So maybe you have to help her formulate her argument, which is really annoying, because you want to win. You're having this dispute. It's like, I want to win. It's like, well, you're not winning that game. You're winning the game. Well, I think about it as the game of games. You want to win the set of games that stretch across time. Freud thought that repression was at the heart of much mental suffering. The difference between repression and deception is a matter of degree, and that's all. It's technical. It's a technical differentiation. And Alfred Adler, who was one of Freud's greatest associates, let's say, and much underappreciated, I would say, he thought that people got into problems because they started to act out a life lie. That's what he called it, a life lie. That's worth looking up, because Adler, although not as charismatic as Freud, was very practical and really foreshadowed a lot of later developments in cybernetic theory. And of course, Jung believed that you could bypass psychotherapy entirely by merely making a proper moral effort in your own life. And Carl Rogers believed that it was honest communication mediated through dialogue that had redemptive consequences. And the behaviors believe that you do a careful microanalysis of the problems that are laid before you and help introduce people to what they're avoiding. You wake up in the morning, your consciousness reemerges from the darkness in which it's been embedded, like the sun coming up, right? Which is why consciousness has always been associated with the sun. We're daytime creatures, and we're creatures of vision. And so we identify consciousness with the light, with illumination, with enlightenment. You wake up in the morning, and what do you have in front of you? Well, it depends whether you're excited or worried, but it doesn't really matter, because it's the same thing. What you have in front of you, this is as far as I can tell, is that you have a field of possibility. You have a field of potential. You might wake up and worry. You think, well, I have to do this, or this series of negative consequences might emerge, and I have these obligations that need to be taken care of for the same reason. Duties, tax bills that have to be opened before they turn into some sort of terrible monster, or we didn't just leap up and think, oh, we better save for tomorrow. It took thousands of years for that idea to emerge, and it emerged in dramatic form, and it was sort of like, well,
society is sort of like a god. No, they weren't thinking this through. It was like, if you're going to represent society, well, it's like this masculine god that's always judging the hell out of you, that's everywhere all at the same time. It's like, yeah, that's true, absolutely. And what do you have to do with it? Well, you have to give it what it wants. Why do you have to give it what it wants? Because it'll crush you if you don't. And that's exactly right. And if you're lucky and you give it the right sacrifice, then it'll smile on you and you get to have a good life. And that was the major discovery of mankind, man. That was a killer discovery. It was like the discovery of the future. You know, we discovered the future as a place.
Dostoevsky, I think, said something like, every man is responsible for everything that happens to him and everything that happens to everyone else. There's a level at which that's metaphysically true, you know, because what happens is that it's failure to act often that's the most catastrophic. You know, I mean, it's to not do the right thing when the situation presents itself, and it's very specific. You know, you're constantly in situations where you could do the right thing if you were willing to take a risk that's actually of relatively moderate size, and you know that you could take the risk, and you know that you should take the risk, and you don't. And that happens to people all the time. And then what happens is the thing that they didn't oppose grows a little bit, and they shrink a little bit, and that starts a loop. Hey.
As far as I can tell, because life is so difficult, you have to do something that's truly worthwhile in order to justify it. And so, well, and that's what all these stories tell you. That's what the story of Jonah is telling you. It's like you have an ethical duty to straighten things up, and if you don't do it, you're going to be sorry.
The first is that life is very difficult and rife with suffering and contaminated by malevolence at every level. There's natural malevolence. That's the proclivity of nature to try to kill you. And there's social malevolence and individual malevolence. And that worsens the essential tragedy of life. And so the fundamental truth, as the religious types have always had it, is that life is suffering. And the consequence of that is that you need a sustaining meaning to help you avoid bitterness.
Yeah.
And then the question is, well, where is that sustaining meaning to be found, if it can be found at all? And the answer to that seems to be not in rights and privileges and impulsive freedom and instantaneous gratification, not in any of that, but in the adoption of responsibility.
Let's say you're an animal and you act and it doesn't go very well, and then you die. Well, you've learned that acting that way didn't work, but now you're dead. So that's not that helpful. And then you might think, well, maybe you should represent how you're going to act. So, you know, here's a box with a snake in it, and your coffee cup is inside the box with the snake in it. And I say to you, imagine picking up the coffee cup, and you imagine it, and you think, oh, I'll pick up that coffee cup, and then the snake will bite me, and I'll die. And so then you decide that implementing the strategy of picking up the coffee cup is probably not a very good idea, and so that stupid idea has to die, and not you. And so Popper's idea was that the reason that we developed the capacity to abstract was so that our stupid ideas could die instead of us. And that's really, it's almost impossible to overstate how brilliant an observation that is.
One of the things I like about speed dating, like at least once, is because it gives you a chance to talk to a very large number of women very rapidly. Well, first of all, that's a good way of, it's exposure, right? It's a good way of overcoming that fear of initial contact. But I think it also introduces you in a very blunt way to the diversity of personality, right? Because what you'll find if you go on a speed dating retreat is that there'll be nothing between you and the girl in many cases. There'll be something there sometimes. Sometimes that's okay. You know, you don't have to be attractive to or attracted to everyone. Forcing exposure to that wide variety of experience in a short period of time can be a good way of overcoming your fear. And a lot of that's just an experience, that fear too, right? So you got to figure out how to overcome that. You already know everything in some sense. You know, you've got a map that covers the whole world.
which is sort of why you can function. And so as long as everything's going fine, you don't really have to adjust your map and you don't have to think. But then if you come across something that makes you think, then what that means is that part of the way you were thinking was wrong. And so when you think something, when you're forced to, then some little part of what you were, your map, the way you represent the world, it has to die because it was wrong. And then it has to be replaced by this new thing. And God only knows how much of what it was that was there has to die. That's part of the magnitude of error problem. And so people don't like to think. And so it's hard to read difficult books like Beyond Good and Evil because you're just forced to think, and it's just exhausting. You wish that he would just go away, which is why they're trying to not teach difficult books in universities anymore. Nietzsche actually, he came up with the most arrogant statement anybody ever made about himself as an author, which is really quite impressive. To come up with the most arrogant statement, that's really something. And he was great at coming up with one-liners, philosophical one-liners. He said, I can write in a sentence what it takes other people a book to write. And then he said, that they can't even write in a book. So that's pretty good, eh? It's like arrogant, and then he topped it. It's like, yes, this is a man who could really write. Anyways, the problem with reading a book like that, Beyond Good and Evil say, is that every damn sentence is a thought.
Is it a line in the New Testament that's relevant to that? Do not cast pearls before swine. And what that means is that if people are not listening to you, stop talking to them. And that is the best piece of advice that I can give you. And what happens is that if you stop talking to people who aren't listening to you and start watching them instead, they will tell you what they're up to. But so if you have things to say them, but you find people that will listen, talk to them. The ones who aren't listening, pull back. Because you're devaluing what you have to say by offering it to an audience that does nothing but reject it. And that's a good guideline to life in general. So pull back. Yeah. Imagine that you wanted to form the perfect union with someone. Let's say it's the perfect sexual union for that matter. I think that requires love. Whenever I've had in my life a sexual experience that wasn't associated with love, I didn't feel right about it. My conscience bothered me very much, very rapidly. And maybe that makes me an outlier, although I don't think so. I think that is how people react, but they refuse to notice. Now, I might be wrong about that. Maybe I'm a prude. It's possible, although I don't think so. But it's possible. But it always struck me that sex was best undertaken within the confines of an ultimately committed relationship. That otherwise it was lesser. It was less than it should be.